It can be your best friend or your worst enemy. I'm talking about the climate that you live in. It can be your best friend or your worst enemy. The climate you choose to live in will really affect every other aspect on your property in some way or another. But other aspects can also affect your climate. But the climate you choose to live in is perhaps the most important decision you make on the property in regards to the scales of permanence. Climate is number one because it's the one that you can do the least about. Granted, there are some things you can do about your climate, but at what cost? That's the important question to ask yourself. And when I'm analyzing property, it's the first thing that I look at. I'm interested in everything else, but climate is the first thing I look at because there's some climates that just suck to live in, that can be very challenging. Now, it doesn't mean that it can't be done. What it does mean is the amount of resources you put into living there will be greater. So the further away you go from comfortable human habitation, the more complicated and costly the project is going to become. So there's some climates that are just better than others. I'm mostly interested, firstly, at risks in regard to climate. So the last video we talked about threats, and there are many threats in terms of climate. You could be in a hurricane zone, a flood zone, tornado alley, a place prone to volcanic activity, but perhaps that's not climate, that's geological, but at the same time it's something that can affect you greatly and can affect the climate. And you could be in a place that gets insane amount of snow, like I kind of am. Actually, there's places that are far worse, but we do get a good amount of snow here. That's a climate risk. And you really want to think about the climate that you're in. And I've found over the years of consulting and helping people find the perfect homestead property or property for their farm, climate is often super overlooked because some people just think Americans are often the victim of this in some way or another, because in the US you have a huge difference of climates from one area to the other. Think about living in northeastern Washington state. Think about living in Moab, Utah. Think about living in Arkansas. Think about living in Florida or upstate New York or Maine. All of these places have radically different climates. And a really good way to understand climate is to use what's called the Köppen-Geiger climate classification system. It's a very handy tool that can really quickly give you a sense of what the climate is like in that particular place. We built a course called Finding the Perfect Homestead Property, and for the last 2 months I've been building this out, profiling properties all across North America in USDA zones 3 through 9, and looking at all the types of climate classifications within the Köppen-Geiger that exist within North America. And it is quite phenomenal the differences in climates we have from one place to another, like for example some of the places that I listed there. But the Köppen-Geiger is an incredibly useful tool. Just by looking at this map, you can see the similarities from place to place. You can see that a CFA climate, which is the vast majority of the US, which is pretty much all the US Southeast, is very similar, and places like that exist in parts of the Mediterranean in Europe. Or you could look at a lot of the BSK climates that exist in much of the center west climates, west of the Cascades in the United States, are similar to places in Afghanistan or northern China. Very similar climates. And the more you can understand the climate you're in, the better you can transpose that information to somewhere that you might not be familiar with, but if it has the same climate zone, you can get a sense of what it is like there. So for example, the climate I'm in is referred to as a DFB climate. And a DFB is a boreal climate that experiences a cold winter, and most of the precipitation we get is in the winter in the form of snow, and then the summers are hot and dry. And there's a lot of places in the United States that are DFB, even more in the US particular are DFA, which is like a DFB. It's a boreal climate, but it gets warmer. And I would encourage you to learn about the climate classification tool. In the online course that we've built, Finding the Perfect Homestead Property, we use this to analyze every single property. And in fact, we use a handy overlay that goes over Google Earth that we can throttle on or off to show the different climate classifications that you're in. It's a super handy tool. But the reason you want to spend so much time understanding the climate is that is really fundamentally one of the major things that you cannot change without significant amounts of resources. And as we go through these next series of videos, we're going to look at each other scale of permanence that we use as a way to evaluate a property. Every representation of the difficulty of that particular scale, climate, geography, water, socioeconomics, just to name a few, get harder and harder to change, or get easier and easier to change as you go down. So we start with the number one hardest thing to change, and that's the climate you're in. That's why it's so important when you're looking for a property and you're thinking, okay, well, I'm from upstate New York. I want to get the hell out of New York, and maybe I want to go west. What kind of climate do I want to live in? Maybe you want to live in something that's not too far off from what you're used to. And so if that was your situation coming from upstate New York, I wouldn't suggest moving to Wyoming, western Nebraska, or Montana, or eastern Idaho. I'd maybe consider living in a place like northeastern Washington state, where you have a very low population density and you have a similar climate than what you would see in upstate New York, or perhaps Vermont, or places like this. Similar, not the same, but similar. Whereas if you look at some of these desert climates in Utah and places even going into Arizona, they're so different than what you might be used to in a place like upstate New York. So it's really important to understand what these climates are. And I would encourage you just to go into Wikipedia. You know, Wikipedia is a bunch of propaganda for anything political or cultural or even historical. However, they're pretty bang on with their information with the climate classification system. Just go into Wikipedia and take a look at this. Click on some of the climate zones that you might be familiar with and look at the list that they'll give you of other places in the world that have a similar climate zone or climate classification. It's very, very helpful, because sometimes, especially when it comes to looking at property for the perfect place to hunker down in, I've said many times in the last number of videos that the best way to find the best place is to look at the most amount of properties in the least amount of time and disqualify as many out of the gate that you can. And understanding the climate classification will allow you to do so far more than just the USDA zones. So the USDA zones really only represent, at least the Canadian plant hardiness map is different than the US plant hardiness map. We use the US one just because it explains something that people can understand more universally, and then when we apply the layer of the climate classification, it gets us that clarity that we want. So the USDA zone plant hardiness only represents the coldest temperature that place typically goes down to, that dictates the local plants and trees that can exist and survive that winter in that area. And so that's only one element. But to understand the climate classification piece lets you know about whether that climate is temperate, arid, tundra, tropical, and then the amount of precipitation that climate gets, and the type of heat that's in that climate, whether it's hot or cold. The climate classification system will give you a really firm understanding of different types of climates, which can then help you eliminate possibilities. Because you might want to look at an entire US map. You might say, okay, to start my search, I'm first going to look at places that I feel politically comfortable to live in. You know, the US has such a plethora of levels of tyranny as you look at whether states are more Republican or Democrat. but also really how much rural area they have too, because rural areas, whether you're in Republican or Democrat, you can start to blur the lines when you get less people. Really, politics is enforced by the people that live there for the most part, in my opinion. Take it for what it's worth. But then you can apply the climate classification and say, you know what, I don't want to live in a BSK climate, which is your sort of high and dry, cold in the winter, hot in the summer, and dry deserts. So that eliminates a massive part of the North American map. You might say, well, I really want to live somewhere, it may be a zone 7 through 9 in a CFA. That's what I'm familiar with. And so now you can basically reduce your search to a particular area of the United States, which makes it better for you. Specify, filter things down, and really get a sense of, what do you want? What's the kind of place you want to live in? You might be from a BSK. You might have grown up in New Mexico. And you might say, well, I want to be somewhere where there's just more green. So you might say, well, but I don't want to be too cold. So maybe I could live in a DFA climate, which is sort of the area that's above where the CFA climates start in the United States, going into Iowa, the parts of Nebraska, South Dakota, is a boreal climate that's a little bit warmer. Once you get into a DFB, where I am, it's a lot colder than a DFA. But you might just think about things that way. I mean, sure, if I could just wave my magic wand and live in the perfect climate, I might choose sort of on the cusp of a CFA to a DFA. I don't mind winter because I like the sort of purging of the soil that winter provides. It really is a reset, It knocks out the pests that were a problem in the summer. It starts fresh. I like the idea of a winter. But you want to ask yourself, what kind of climate do you want to live in? And that really should set the precedent, the beginning of filtering down your search once you understand what your context is, your non-negotiables and negotiables. And once you've eliminated any potential threats in the nearby area, climate is the first thing you want to consider when you're looking for the perfect homestead property. So if this information that I'm talking about sounds cool to you guys and you want to learn more, head over to homestead.freedomfarmers.com, and I've got a waiting list there for this course that I've constructed, which goes into hyper detail over many, many hours of content of me analyzing and reviewing properties right down to the nitty-gritty details, so that you can learn from me. You can see me do these analyses over and over again for all different types of USDA zones 3 through 9 and all the climate classifications that exist within North America. We've profiled most U.S. states. Some U.S. states was actually very difficult to find eligible properties in, but we do our best to cover the whole continent of North America and show you an analysis of potential homestead candidate properties in those areas. Now, whether those properties are still on the market or not, we'll see. A lot of them, actually, the prices have come down since we started working on the course till now. But the point of the course isn't to give you eligible places to buy. You might benefit from that in some de facto way or another. But the point of the course is to show you how I evaluate properties based on this framework that we're discussing in these videos. We hope to have this out in April, and I hope to see a lot of you guys in there. And I hope this can help you get yourself on the land faster so that you don't get caught up in a lot of the competition that's going to come for these bargain basement prices that are going to be happening as the economy and market start to correct. All right, folks, we'll see you in the next one.